Before the city wakes, the river speaks. It is 2 o'clock in the morning. The year is 1885. The Thames moves through London as it has always moved. Vast, indifferent, carrying everything the city wishes to forget. Upriver, the lights of Westminster reflect in broken fragments across the water. Downriver, the docks of Wapping and Limehouse breathe in the darkness, timber and rope and coal dust settling into the fog. A waterman's skiff moves through the shadows near Blackfriars Bridge. One figure, one lantern. The light catches the water's surface and holds there, trembling. The man in the boat is not fishing. He is not ferrying passengers. He has not come to observe the city's nocturnal beauty, though the Thames at 2 in the morning possesses a cold and terrible grandeur that no painter has ever quite captured. He has come because he received a message. A body has been reported near the South Pier. This is his work. London in the final decades of the 19th century was a city of 5 million souls, the largest metropolitan concentration in human history. It was a city of gaslit streets and penny newspapers, of music halls and gin palaces, of empire and aspiration. It was also a city of appalling mortality. The poor died of cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and malnutrition. They died in factories, in warehouses, in flooded tenement rooms. They fell from scaffolding and were crushed beneath cart wheels. They drank themselves to death in the courts and alleys of the rookeries, and a great many of them died in, or entered, the Thames. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner's annual reports for the 1880s record, on average, between 250 and 300 bodies recovered from the Thames each year. Historians of Victorian London believe the true figure was considerably higher. Not every body was found. Not every found body was reported. Not every reported body was recorded. The river absorbed the city's dead with a thoroughness that the city itself found convenient. Among those whose occupation required them to navigate this grim arithmetic were the Thames mudlarks, the river police, the watermen, and a particular class of individuals who occupied a category both practical and peculiar: men paid to recover the dead. One such man was Edmund Hartley, and what Edmund Hartley noticed would, in a different age, have changed the course of criminal investigation. The parish records of St. George in the East, Stepney, contain an entry dated September 4, 1851, registering the birth of one Edmund James Hartley, son of Thomas Hartley, occupation listed as lighterman, and his wife Catherine, née Walsh. It is a brief notation, as such entries invariably are, a few lines of clerk's handwriting, the paper slightly foxed with age, giving no indication of the life that would follow from that unremarkable morning. The Hartleys were a river family. Thomas Hartley spent 31 years working the lighters, the flat-bottomed barges that transported cargo between the great ocean-going vessels anchored in the Thames and the warehouses of the dock estates. It was physical, dangerous, poorly remunerated work, conducted in all weathers upon a river that killed approximately one lighterman per week through accident, exhaustion, or exposure to its disease-laden waters. The river, for the Hartley family, was not a backdrop to life. It was life itself, its rhythms, its dangers, its economic logic, its culture. Edmund Hartley grew up on its banks. He learned to row before he could write. He knew the tidal patterns, the hidden currents, the places where the water ran shallow and the places where it swallowed objects and people without trace. The 1871 census records Edmund Hartley, aged 19, as a dock laborer residing at Shadwell, with his parents and 3 younger siblings. By 1881, he has moved to lodgings in Wapping, his occupation now listed, in the enumerator's careful copperplate, as River Recovery Agent, a designation that encompassed, in practice, the retrieval of lost cargo, the salvage of sunken materials, and, with increasing regularity as the decade progressed, the recovery of human remains. The mechanics of river recovery work in Victorian London were governed by a set of arrangements that were partly formal and mostly not. The Thames Division of the Metropolitan Police, the River Police, established in 1798 and the oldest police force in the world, held primary jurisdiction over deaths in and upon the river. However, the division was chronically understaffed, its officers responsible for policing some 50 miles of tidal waterway with a fleet of boats that never numbered more than 40. Into this institutional gap stepped private operators. Men like Edmund Hartley worked under informal arrangements with local coroners, with the Thames Division, and occasionally with private families seeking deceased relatives. Payment was irregular and modest. A typical fee for recovering a body in the 1880s ranged from 2 shillings and 6 pence to 5 shillings, depending upon the condition of the remains and the distance traveled. It was, by any measure, a grim economy. The process of recovery itself demanded skills that were equal parts practical and psychological. Bodies in the Thames did not behave predictably. Depending upon when they had entered the water, the temperature, the tidal state, and the presence of river traffic, a body might be found within hours or might travel considerable distances before becoming lodged against a pier or embankment. Edmund Hartley learned all of this empirically, not from manuals, there were none, but from the river itself, over years of observation, error, and grim accumulation of experience. He learned that fog, counterintuitively, could be advantageous, forcing him to navigate by sound and touch and developing, in consequence, a sensitivity to the water's movement that more visually dependent operators lacked. He learned the locations of particular eddies and backcurrents where objects and bodies tended to collect. He learned the smell that preceded a find, and the particular stillness of water disturbed by something beneath the surface. He learned to read the river like a living thing. And the river, over time, began to tell him things that no one else was listening to hear. It began with geography. Edmund Hartley kept a personal ledger, a practice unusual enough among men of his occupation and social station as to suggest either an education beyond what his origins would imply or an unusually disciplined mind. This ledger, which survived in the possession of his descendants until its donation to the Museum of London in 1962, constitutes one of the most remarkable documents of Victorian social observation in existence. It is not a literary document. It contains no flourishes, no reflections, no philosophy. It is columns of data, date, location, description of find, condition of remains, coroner's verdict, payment received. 312 entries spanning 17 years, from 1875 to 1892. What emerges from this data, viewed in aggregate, is a geography of death. Certain locations on the Thames appeared in Hartley's ledger with a frequency that could not be attributed to current or tide alone. The stretch between Waterloo Bridge and Blackfriars Bridge accounted for a disproportionate number of recoveries, 23 in Hartley's record across the period, versus a more typical average of 8 to 12 per comparable stretch. The reaches near Wapping Old Stairs and the area below the West India Docks similarly appear with anomalous frequency. Hartley marked these locations on a hand-drawn map, crude, utilitarian, entirely without the cartographic elegance of the Ordnance Survey that is tucked into the ledger's inside cover. The clustering of his notations around certain points is immediately apparent to the modern eye. It would have been apparent to any eye that cared to look. The coroners of Southwark and the City of London were not looking. Hartley's ledger reveals a second pattern, seasonal in nature. The winter months produced more bodies. This was expected, but within this seasonal pattern, Hartley observed a more granular periodicity. The weeks immediately following quarterly rent days, which fell in March, June, September, and December, consistently produced elevated numbers of recoveries. The connection is not difficult to decipher. Quarterly rent demands drove families beyond the threshold of survivability. Those who could not pay were evicted. Those who were evicted, in the depths of winter or the grinding poverty of summer, had nowhere to go. The Thames, for some, represented not a site of violence, but of relief. The third pattern was the most disturbing, and the one that Hartley himself found most difficult to reconcile with the official record. A significant proportion of the bodies Hartley recovered bore injuries that he did not believe consistent with accidental drowning or voluntary death. A man recovered near Shadwell Dock in February 1883 exhibited bruising to the posterior cranium that Hartley described in his ledger as a blow of considerable force, inconsistent with impact upon the water or riverbed. A woman found in February 1887 near Queenhithe had ligature marks upon the wrists, partly obscured by immersion but present to the careful eye. The coroner's verdict in both cases, found drowned. Hartley's frustration is visible in his handwriting. Ordinarily regular and controlled, it becomes, at these entries, slightly compressed, slightly harder. He does not editorialize. He does not accuse. He records what he observed and what the official record determined. But the juxtaposition across entry after entry, year after year, speaks for itself. The river was not merely receiving London's accidental dead. It was, at least in some portion, receiving London's murdered. And the system designed to establish the truth of violent death was not, in all cases, equal to the task. Among 312 entries in Edmund Hartley's ledger, one occupies more space than any other. The handwriting slows. The columns, usually so rigorously maintained, give way at one point to a marginal notation that runs the full length of the page, cramped, careful, as though Hartley was aware he was writing beyond the formal purpose of the document, but could not stop himself. The entry is dated November 11th, 1889. The location, below Queenhithe Dock, on the north bank of the Thames. The body was that of a young woman. Hartley estimated her age at between 16 and 22 years. She was slightly built, her hair dark, her clothing consistent with factory or domestic service employment. She had been in the water, Hartley believed, for approximately 4 days. She carried nothing that identified her. No papers, no jewelry, no distinguishing marks beyond a small scar on her left hand, consistent with machinery injury. She was, in the language of the coroner's court, a person unknown. The inquest was brief. The Southwark coroner heard evidence from Hartley regarding the recovery, consulted his notes regarding the condition of the body, and directed his jury accordingly. The jury retired for 11 minutes. Verdict: found drowned. Unknown causes. No evidence of foul play. The young woman was buried in a pauper's grave in Southwark, her plot unmarked, her name unrecorded, her story unbegun. What Hartley recorded in his marginal notation concerned 3 specific observations that he had communicated verbally to the inquest, but which he believed had not been adequately considered. The first: the young woman's wrists bore marks consistent with restraint. The marks were faint. 4 days in the Thames had worked upon them considerably, but Hartley, who had recovered more than 300 bodies over 14 years, was not uncertain. The second: the distribution of bruising across her upper body suggested that she had been forcibly held beneath the water rather than having entered it voluntarily or accidentally. He was not a physician. He knew this. He said so. He also knew what he had seen. The third observation was not forensic. It was contextual. In the weeks prior to the recovery, Hartley had heard that a young woman answering this description had been employed at a waxworks manufactory in Upper Thames Street. She had disappeared following a dispute with a senior male employee. The dispute concerned the withholding of wages, and something else, which the women who spoke of it declined to specify further, but whose nature Hartley, a man of limited formal education but considerable human perception, did not have to guess at. He had taken this information to the Thames Division. The duty sergeant had noted it, in the way that duty sergeants in understaffed divisions note information that will require considerable investigative resource to pursue. Nothing followed. The manufactory continued to operate. The senior employee, so far as Hartley's subsequent inquiries could determine, continued in his post. Hartley wrote in his ledger, "She was not no one. She came from somewhere. She was known to someone who has not come forward. The river knows what she was. I am sorry that I could not do more." It is the only moment of personal feeling in 312 entries. It lasts for 2 lines, and then the ledger resumes its columns, its dates, its locations, its verdicts. Life and death went on. Edmund Hartley retired from river recovery work in 1892, aged 41. His ledger records a final note: left service. Hands failing. Eyes still good. He died in 1907 in the Whitechapel Infirmary of pneumonia. The death register describes his occupation as formerly waterman. He left no property of note and no published record of his observations. His ledger was discovered by his granddaughter during the clearance of a Hackney storage room in 1959. She donated it to the Museum of London 3 years later, believing it might be of some historical interest. She was right, though not in the way she perhaps imagined. What Edmund Hartley practiced, in his wordless, unsystematic, largely unacknowledged way, was an early form of what we would now call forensic epidemiology, the study of patterns in death to identify causes, conditions, and, sometimes, human agency. He did not have the vocabulary. He did not have institutional support. He did not have the authority to compel further investigation of the cases that troubled him. What he had was 17 years of patient, meticulous attention to a river that everyone else had learned to look past. The Thames of the Victorian era was, in many respects, a perfect mirror of the society it ran through. It received what the city produced and revealed what the city wished to conceal. It carried wealth, the cargo of empire, the commerce of the world's greatest trading port, and it carried poverty in all its material consequence. The bodies Edmund Hartley recovered were, in the overwhelming majority, working class. They were factory workers and dock laborers, domestic servants and street vendors, women driven by destitution and men destroyed by debt. They were the people who built the city and were broken by it. They died in its rivers and were buried in its pauper graves, their names unrecorded, their stories untold, their deaths classified with the administrative brevity of a system that had more bodies to process than time to mourn. This is the dark arithmetic of industrial modernity. A society that produces wealth through the systematic exploitation of human labor must also produce, as its necessary consequence, a class of people for whom death is close, cheap, and quickly forgotten. The river absorbed all of it. We cannot know, now, how many of the deaths Edmund Hartley recorded were what the coroner declared them to be: accidents, voluntary deaths, misfortunes, and how many were something else. The forensic tools that would permit retrospective analysis do not exist for bodies long since dissolved into the earth of pauper graves. The administrative records are incomplete, the witness testimony long expired. What we can know is that the system designed to answer these questions was inadequate to the task, not always through malice, frequently through indifference, occasionally through the simple arithmetic of overwhelm. Too many dead, too few resources, too little institutional will to invest in lives that society had already devalued while they were living. The Thames today moves through a different city. The docks are apartments. The manufactories are galleries and restaurants. The riverside streets that once ran with the daily traffic of empire now host the morning runners and weekend tourists of a post-industrial capital. But the river has not forgotten. Archaeological work on the Thames foreshore continues to surface objects from the Victorian era: clay pipes, ceramic fragments, the occasional leather sole, but also human bone. The tidal action of the river, relentless and unchanged across the centuries, still turns up material from the pauper burials that once flanked its banks. There is no monument to the unnamed dead of the Victorian Thames. There is no single, complete, accessible record of those whose lives ended in its water. Edmund Hartley's ledger is the closest thing that exists. 312 entries, 312 lives, many of them ending without name or explanation or justice. The river knows what it received. We are left to decide whether knowing that is enough, or whether history's obligation to the dead extends further than the recording of their absence. Night on the Thames. Fog. Bells. Water moving through a city that has always been larger than its own memory. Somewhere, a lantern on the water. A man with a ledger and a boat and 17 years of careful, unacknowledged attention. He is gone now. The water remains. It is still saying things that most of us are not listening to hear.